on chapter 17. Chapter 17 is concerned with a few of the more important endocrine glands. And I say few because the pituitary gland...
It's not posted again.
I'm sorry. Okay. Here, I'll do that real quick for you. We got plenty of time. I don't really have a whole lot to cover today. So just take me a minute. Yeah, it should be up momentarily. Okay, so as I was starting to say, originally said we were going to be talking about a few of the more important endocrine glands because the pituitary gland is really two different glands in one. They're two glands that develop from different tissues in the embryo, and so it's not surprising that they would secrete different hormones. Okay, so I'm going to go over the hypothalamus is where pretty much everything starts in the endocrine system, and then we're going to go on to the pituitary gland, which then interacts and helps to control most all of the other endocrine glands in the body. Also, just before we get going too much further, don't forget to work on your Connect assignments. Okay. Oh, and related to that, one other item. I made up a new Connect course for this semester. Okay. But I didn't delete the one from last semester. So I had some people that started on one and then finished up a chapter on the other one. You'll still get credit for it if you do it in the other section from last semester. I did go ahead and assign the chapters under both courses. So I may have to go in and manually record the grades in Canvas, but you will get credit for them whichever section that you do it under. Okay. All right. If you have any questions about that, feel free to let me know later. So today we're going to look at the anatomical relationships between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. In other words, we're going to see where they're located in relation to one another. We're going to take a quick look at the embryological development of the anterior and posterior pituitary, which sort of explains why it has two parts and why they secrete different hormones. Then we're going to look at all the hormones produced by the hypothalamus and each of the lobes of the pituitary, and then we'll briefly summarize the functions of each of the hormones. Now, we're not going to be going over all the endocrine glands in this chapter because we'll do that as we go through the different organ systems. So when we get to the urinary system, for example, we'll talk about the hormones that affect the urinary system, okay, and so on. And then we're going to explain how the release of pituitary hormones is controlled by the hypothalamus. And we'll see that the hormones released by the anterior pituitary gland are stimulated by a different mechanism than the pituitary gland. All right. So the hypothalamus is located just inferior to the thalamus of the diencephalon. Okay, remember that the diencephalon is the second highest level of the brain. What's the name for the highest region of the brain and the largest region? It's divided up into lobes. Divided up into 5 pairs of lobes. What's that? Say that louder.
Frontal.
Well, that's part of it, but what's the name for the whole region that the frontal lobe is part of? Go ahead and say it. You probably know. You're probably all thinking it. You're just afraid to say it. But don't be afraid.
The cerebrum?
Cerebrum, yeah, it's the cerebrum. That's the highest level. Second highest level is the diencephalon. Remember, the diencephalon is made up of an epithalamus, which is above the thalamus, then the thalamus, which is kind of an oval bulge that bulges into the third ventricle, and then below the thalamus is the hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus has a large number of autonomic control centers that control things like sleep and wake cycles, hunger, thirst, and even sex drive. But there's also some clusters of neurons in the hypothalamus that produce hormones that control the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. Okay, so this is the floor of the diencephalon. So just above, up here, right at the top, that would be where the thalamus would be located. And then hanging down off of the hypothalamus, just posterior to the optic chiasm, is a narrow stalk of tissue. That narrow stalk of tissue right here is called the infundibulum. Okay, that's the stalk that connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary. All right. So the pituitary gland is made up of 2 parts. On the anterior side, this dark shaded area, that's called the anterior pituitary or the adenohypophysis. Okay, that's all one word, adenohypophysis. That's another term for the anterior pituitary. On the posterior side over here is the posterior pituitary or the neurohypophysis. Okay, that's called the neurohypophysis because it actually develops from part of the developing brain of the embryo. As we'll see in a little bit, the anterior pituitary actually develops as an outgrowth of the oral cavity. So they develop from the same embryonic tissue, but they develop from embryonic tissue from different places. Because actually the roof of the mouth of the embryo is made up of ectoderm. It's lined with ectoderm. And the brain also develops from ectoderm. But they are differentiated even at an early stage of development. So let's talk about the development, okay? This is a very early human embryo. And at this stage, this is about, this is probably about, in a human, it would be about 5 weeks after fertilization, okay? Because we can see the telencephalon right here, it's starting to enlarge. That's what develops into the cerebrum. And then right behind it, this area right here, is the diencephalon. Eventually the eyes develop from the diencephalon as well. And then behind the diencephalon, we have the mesencephalon, or the midbrain. Below that, we have the metencephalon, and then finally the myelencephalon. Okay, now, the anterior pituitary actually developed from an outpocketing of the roof of the oral cavity of the embryo. So this right here is the mouth. Okay, see that? There's the mouth. And then this would be the oral cavity right in here. Now, the anterior pituitary develops from an outpocketing of the roof of the mouth. Embryologists refer to that outpocketing as Rathke's pouch. So the anterior pituitary develops from Rathke's pouch. Now, some of the ectoderm from the surface of the embryo, it actually folds inward to form the oral cavity. So that oral cavity is actually lined, at least in part, with ectoderm. Now, the posterior pituitary develops from an outpocketing of the diencephalon, from the floor of the diencephalon. So here's, this is the part of the diencephalon right here. There's a little pouch that forms an outpocketing. That's called the infundibulum. And part of that forms that stalk in the adult that we call the infundibulum. Now, eventually, the Rathke's pouch loses its contact with the pharynx, which is, of course, sort of a continuation of the oral cavity, and it fuses with the it fuses with the infundibulum, or what's also known as the neurohypophyseal bud. It's another name for the infundibulum. That's probably the more correct descriptive name for it. Embryologists still call that the infundibulum, though. They're a little slower to, anatomists are a little faster at changing to more descriptive names. So eventually, this Rathke's pouch fuses with the infundibulum or the neurohypophyseal bud to form the pituitary. But the two parts of the pituitary that are formed from those two buds physiologically remain distinct. Since they're derived from different tissues, they eventually release different hormones. Okay? But the release of hormones from both the anterior pituitary, or the adenohypophysis, and the posterior pituitary, or the neurohypophysis, is controlled by the hypothalamus. Now, it used to be a long time ago when I was growing up, they always said the pituitary gland was the master gland of the body because it releases hormones that regulate all the other endocrine glands. And that's partly true, but it's not really a master gland because the release of those pituitary hormones is actually controlled by hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. So if there really is a master gland of the body, it's not the pituitary gland, it's actually the hypothalamus. Okay. So the hypothalamus releases a large number of hormones that are either called releasing hormones or statins. The releasing hormones stimulate the release of pituitary gland hormones. The statins inhibit the release of hormones from the pituitary. So I'm not going to expect that you know the names of all these, by the way, of the hypothalamus hormones. Just be aware there are hormones that are released by the hypothalamus that stimulate the release of the pituitary gland hormones, or in some cases they may inhibit it. So one example is thyrotropin-releasing hormone, or TRH for short. Thyrotropin-releasing hormone stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones. Another one is corticotropin-releasing hormone, or CRH. Corticotropin-releasing hormone stimulates the adrenal glands to release their hormones. And the adrenal cortex is a very complex endocrine gland because it releases over a dozen different hormones. We'll talk about those a little bit later. Another one that's important in regulating the reproductive systems is gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH for short. GnRH regulates the release of testosterone, or excuse me, GnRH regulates the release of FSH and RH from the anterior pituitary. FSH and LH in turn regulate the release of hormones from the gonads in both males or females. And we'll talk more. We'll get into the gonadotropin releasing hormone and FSH and LH and testosterone when we get to the reproductive cycle towards the end of the semester. Then there are two other hypothalamus hormones that are statins. One of them is prolactin inhibiting hormone, or PH. That inhibits secretion of prolactin when females are not pregnant. Okay. The other one is somatostatin. Somatostatin inhibits secretion of growth hormone and thyroid stimulating hormone, mainly in adults. This growth hormone is secreted in a lot larger quantities in infants and children and adolescents. The amount of growth hormone that's released decreases in adults once you reach a mature size. So, for example, this just shows all of the different organs that are eventually affected by the hormones of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus secretes TRH, GnRH, CRH, and GnRH. The TRH stimulates the release of prolactin from the anterior pituitary. That stimulates develop of the glandular tissue in the mammary glands in pregnant women. Also, it stimulates the thyroid gland to release thyroxine, which is the thyroid hormone. GnRH stimulates the release of LH and FSH from the anterior pituitary. Those hormones in turn stimulate the production of testosterone in the male and estrogen in the female. Corticotropic releasing hormone stimulates the release of ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, from the anterior pituitary. That stimulates the adrenal cortex to release its hormones. And then GHRH stimulates the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone stimulates both the growth of muscles and other tissues, and it stimulates the liver to produce a hormone called insulin-like growth hormone. And together, both insulin-like growth hormone and growth hormone, together they promote the growth of skeletal muscle, mainly as children are growing larger. So the insulin-like growth factor, that helps the muscle tissue to take up insulin, which allows it to take up more glucose, which is necessary for growth. All right, some of the other, there are two other hormones that are produced in the hypothalamus, but they're released from the posterior pituitary. So these two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH or vasopressin, they're produced in the hypothalamus, and then they're transported through the axon of a bundle of nerves down to the posterior pituitary, where those two hormones are released. So they're released from the posterior pituitary, but they're actually synthesized in the hypothalamus. So oxytocin functions mostly in pregnant women, and it stimulates uterine contractions during labor and also the release of milk during lactation. So the stimulus of a baby nursing on the breast stimulates the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin produces the letdown reflex that allows the milk to be released from the mammary glands. In males, oxytocin may aid in the propulsion of semen during ejaculation and feelings of sexual satisfaction during intercourse and emotional bonding of both sexes. Antidiuretic hormone is another hormone produced in the hypothalamus but released from the posterior pituitary. Antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, stimulates the incorporation of water channels in the collecting ducts of the kidneys, and that increases water reabsorption out of the urine and back into the kidney. So ADH or vasopressin increases water retention. And ADH is released mainly when a person gets dehydrated and the osmolarity of body fluids increases. That stimulates ADH release from the posterior pituitary. And that causes the kidneys to conserve water, reabsorbs water. Without ADH, then the water is not reabsorbed, and so it just passes out of the body along with the urine, along with the waste products that are in urine. So antidiuretic hormone is the one that mentioned this on Friday, I believe. That's the hormone that is lacking in people that have diabetes insipidus, which causes people to produce very copious quantities of urine, up to like 15 liters of urine a day. Of course, that's going to stimulate thirst because that's going to cause a person to be dehydrated. So they have to drink just as much water as they lose. Otherwise, their blood volume would start decreasing and could potentially cause a drop of blood pressure. All right, so we talked about some of the hormones released by the anterior pituitary and also some of the ones that are released by the posterior pituitary. The mechanism by which those hormones are stimulated to be released differs between the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. So let's start first with this diagram down here on the lower right, this one down here. Okay. This one shows how the releasing hormones are transported from the hypothalamus down to the anterior pituitary. So the way that those releasing hormones are transported to the anterior pituitary is through blood vessels. So what happens is the hypothalamus releasing hormones into the interstitial fluid of the hypothalamus, and those releasing hormones get taken up into capillaries. There's a capillary bed in the hypothalamus. And then from that capillary bed, the releasing hormones are transported through a portal vessel that travels down through the infundibulum, which is the stalk. And so what a portal vessel is, a portal vessel or a portal vein is a vein that's located between two capillary beds. So in this system, between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, you have one capillary bed up here in the hypothalamus. You have another one down here in the anterior pituitary. In between, you have a vein. So that vein is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal vein. Okay, that's kind of a mouthful. But if you break it down, it makes sense. The first part of that name, hypothalamo, refers to the hypothalamus. The second part, hypophyseal, that's another name for the pituitary gland. So it's the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal vein. So that transports the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus down to this network of capillaries in the anterior pituitary. So once the releasing hormones get into these capillaries, it diffuses out of the capillaries into the cells of the anterior pituitary. That stimulates them to release the anterior pituitary hormones. which include thyroid stimulating hormone, growth hormone, FSH, LH, and let's see, what's the other one? Prolactin and adrenocorticotropic hormone. There we go. So those 6 hormones. All right, now the communication between the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary is very different. Okay, posterior pituitary is also known as the neural hypophysis, and that's because it's derived from the embryonic brain. So since it's derived from brain tissue, it's not surprising that the posterior pituitary would have neurons. And it does. In fact, there's neurons that are up here in the hypothalamus. That's where the posterior pituitary hormones are synthesized. That's where the ADH and the oxytocin is synthesized, is up here in the cell bodies of those neurons. Then the hormones are transported through the axons of these neurons. Those axons travel through the infundibulum down to the posterior pituitary. So those posterior pituitary hormones then are released from the axon terminals in the posterior pituitary into the bloodstream. Okay, there's capillaries in the posterior pituitary as well. So when these neurons that actually have cell bodies up here in the hypothalamus release those hormones, it goes into the capillaries, and then from there it goes into the bloodstream. So posterior pituitary and the hypothalamus communicate via neurons, whereas the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary communicate by way of blood vessels, which are made up of 2 capillary beds with a portal vessel in between. Okay. All right. So just to summarize, the anterior pituitary produces follicle-stimulating hormone in both males and females, even though the name follicle-stimulating hormone only refers to its function in the female. FSH and LH are produced in both males and females, and they're both involved in the regulation of the male and female reproductive systems. So what FSH does in the female is it stimulates secretion of the ovarian sex hormones, namely estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen stimulates the development of the follicles, which contain the oocytes, which develop into a mature egg, and FSH, and in the male, FSH stimulates sperm cell production. Okay, so basically, in both males and females, FSH stimulates the development of the gametes, which are the egg and sperm cells. Luteinizing hormone, LH, likewise, is named for its function in the female. In the female, LH stimulates ovulation about halfway through the menstrual cycle. And then, after ovulation, it stimulates the empty follicle to develop into a corpus luteum, which begins to secrete progesterone. So luteinizing hormone causes ovulation and also stimulates the release of progesterone from the corpus luteum. In males, luteinizing hormone stimulates the secretion of testosterone, which is necessary for proper development of sperm cells in the testes. Okay, thyroid stimulating hormone then stimulates the secretion of thyroid hormones from the thyroid glands. Adrenocorticotropic hormone stimulates the adrenal glands to release its hormones like the glucocorticoids, which stimulates the break down a glycogen to form glucose, which increases blood glucose levels. Prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk after birth. Also enhances secretion of testosterone in males. And then growth hormone stimulates mitosis and cellular differentiation, along with that insulin-like growth factor that's produced by the liver in response to growth hormone. So if insufficient growth hormone is released in infants, then that results in a condition called pituitary dwarfism. And if a person doesn't have normal levels of growth hormone early on in life, just after birth, then they're not going to grow very tall. Okay. Too much growth hormone, that results in gigantism. If that happens early on in life, if all of a sudden there's a sudden increase in growth hormone in an adult, that results in a condition called acromegaly. Okay. In acromegaly, the only bones that are able to grow are the ones where the epiphyseal plate has not completely ossified. So it causes increase in the length of the fingers and also the lower jaw in adults. Now, the hypothalamus doesn't really control the release of the pituitary glands without any other input. There's also negative feedback loops that help to prevent the release of too much of the pituitary gland hormones. So, for example, the hypothalamus releases thyroid releasing hormone. That stimulates the anterior pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, which causes the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone increases a person's metabolic rate, causes their body to burn more calories. Now, thyroid hormone also has a negative feedback effect on both the hypothalamus as well as the anterior pituitary. So if too much thyroxine is released, which is called hyperthyroidism, if everything is working as it should, those elevated levels of thyroxine are going to inhibit the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary so that it starts decreasing the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. And so that will bring thyroid levels back down to normal. So there are feedback loops for all of those releasing hormones that help to regulate. So there's an interaction between the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the endocrine glands that those control. All right, then the posterior pituitary just produces two hormones. ADH increases water retention, thus reducing urine volume, prevents dehydration. It's also called vasopressin because it can also cause vasoconstriction. Oxytocin is released during sexual arousal and orgasm. That stimulates uterine contractions and also propulsion of semen. It increases the chance that fertilization will occur. Also promotes feeling of sexual satisfaction and emotional bonding between partners. And during childbirth, oxytocin is released in response to the stretching of the cervix, and that increases labor contractions during delivery. Also, it stimulates the release of milk during lactation in response to the suckling of the infant, and it promotes emotional bonding between the lactating mother and the infant. All right. Any questions? So this is a diagram from our textbook that you probably should have remembered seeing one time before. I showed this to you right near the beginning of the first semester. I use this as an example of positive feedback because oxytocin is released in a positive feedback cycle that cause the contractions of the smooth muscle in the walls of the uterus to get stronger and stronger until the cervix is dilated enough that the baby can be delivered. So what happens near the end of gestation is the baby usually rotates around until its head is facing down onto the cervix, which is the opening of the uterus. That stretches the cervix. When the cervix is stretched, that stimulates stretch receptors. Those stretch receptors then send signals up the spinal cord to the brain. That stimulates the release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin goes into the bloodstream, it circulates throughout the whole body, and it stimulates contractions of the smooth muscles in the walls of the uterus. It actually stimulates contractions in all the smooth muscles of the body. Okay, so when those smooth muscles in the walls of the uterus contract, that squeezes down on the fetus more strongly. The more that the smooth muscles in the uterus contract, the more the baby's head is pushed down on the cervix. The more the baby's head is pushed down, the more stretching. The more stretching, the more oxytocin is released. So that causes a positive feedback where oxytocin levels rise higher and higher. Contractions subsequently increase more and more until eventually the cervix is stretched wide enough that the doctor tells the mother she can start pushing now. And then she can actually start using her skeletal, her abdominal muscles to push down, and then eventually, if everything goes right, she can deliver the baby. Okay, so that's how oxytocin works. Right? So oxytocin is kind of released during delivery. It's a reflex, really. It's a reflex that works by positive feedback. Okay, let's do some questions. All right, so first one says, which hormone would be best to treat a patient with acromegaly? Acromegaly occurs when certain body parts grow larger in the adult, especially in the fingers and the lower jaw. This is a tough one. It's a tough question. So I'll help you out here. What's the hormone involved in acromegaly? GH, right. Acromegaly is sort of the opposite of dwarfism. So the hormone that's involved is growth hormone. Dwarfism is when you don't have enough growth hormone. Acromegaly is just the opposite. So what hormone would you need to counteract the effects of that? One with the most votes is somatostatin, and then that'd be correct. Statins are hypothalamus releasing, or hypothalamus hormones that inhibit the release of something. So somatostatin inhibits the growth of the somatic portion of the body, which includes the muscles. Does anybody know what's the most common statin that's used as a therapeutic drug today? Anybody know? You may be too young to know this. It's usually people start taking it when they get older. What's that? Okay, yeah, exactly. Well, what do those do? Yeah. The cholesterol lowering medication is a type of statin, and it helps to lower cholesterol levels. All right, here's another one. How many hormones are synthesized by the posterior pituitary? So if you could name them all, you ought to be able to figure out how many of them there are. You ought to be able to figure this one out by process of elimination. Okay, last call. Okay, most of you said 3, 0, 0. Okay, why is that? How many hormones are synthesized by the posterior pituitary? Remember, hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary are synthesized in the hypothalamus. So there's none that are synthesized. This is kind of a trick question, I'll admit. Okay, they're synthesized in the hypothalamus, and then they're transported down through axons to the posterior pituitary where they're released. So there are none that are synthesized by the posterior pituitary. The ones that are released are ADH and oxytocin. Okay, that's it then. So, our first test is on Monday. Okay, Friday I plan on doing some review. We may do some review on Wednesday as well.